Hey there, people of Earth. This is the Principled Uncertainty podcast, and I am doing a cold opening this time around. And you can hear that I'm sort of getting sick, so if you can bear with the nasal congestion that's going on, I'm going to work through it tonight because it's late, it's cold, I've been working, I'm tired, but I want a podcast. And there's no music this week. This is just a cold intro. There are no guests. It's just me, Tyler, talking to you. And right now I'm live streaming, mostly for the purposes of recording video. But if you're out there watching me live stream, thank you for joining in for this week's edition of the Principled Uncertainty podcast. I'm doing something a little different this week. And I've been saying that a lot lately. So it might be that the podcast is just evolving as we see it now. So this one's going to be a little bit different. There will be no talk of video games. There won't really be any talk of media or tech, except for one thing. I'm going to be doing an episode this week about a book I am publishing. So this is my chance to sort of give the history of the book that I'm publishing, Boogie House, which will be available on 12/13/14. So Saturday, December the 13th, 2014, the book will be available. And I thought it would be nice to just sit down and talk about how I came by the idea for the book and how it came to be in its many iterations and how it ended up where it is today and where I see the series going in the future. So this is going to be about books and the writing process, and it's going to be a little bit different, but I'm really excited about it. And there may be a few of these in the future leading up to the publication of the book. So you might hear me talk about the book a little bit more than normal. And it won't go away after December the 13th, but it won't be a weekly fixture. And it might not after this week either, but we'll see how it goes. I thought I would experiment with the art form and see what's going on. So, here I am, here to talk about the book. Boogie House started as an idea I got in college when I first started writing with an eye toward publishing. I had plenty of ideas, and I was influenced by a lot of writers, namely the sorts of people you would expect. Anyone who's read the things that I've written would expect that I am influenced by people like Stephen King. But mostly in college, I was an English major at the University of Georgia and was fascinated with Southern literature, as I am with most things Southern. And so it shouldn't be any surprise that when I started writing books about the South. And the first novel I wrote, which I unfortunately titled The Hunger's Artist, right out of college. Originally I called it The Hunger, and that didn't work because of the David Bowie movie of the same name. But the first book I wrote was kind of about the South, but also about these other weird ideas about writers and how they consume their consumers, and it was sort of a weird cannibalistic sort of writer novel thing. So they always say that you've run out of ideas if your main character is a writer, and so I guess I was out of ideas from the very start. But I wrote a novel, and then I kept writing novels, and most of them centered around the South. And I'm eventually going to get those out in some form or another, but they were mostly about me learning the craft. I mean, the first book was about a southern college town and a big city writer, New York City, like modern Stephen King person. And the second book was about the South as well, but it was about a small town that had an intersection that was closed down and abandoned. The construction project abandoned because it was believed to be haunted, and it haunted this town and was reawakened. And it was one of those kinds of stories. And I went on and wrote a lot of novels about the South and about Georgia, where I'm from specifically. And I thought that is my niche. So eventually, actually, as far back as I can recall starting writing, I had a couple of ideas. circulating around my head. One was after I finished the first novel, I had a couple of ideas for novels. I had a couple of stories that I was handwriting and one I was typing. One of the stories I know that I abandoned early on was a story about this guy named Jacob whose dad killed his mom, and yet he decides after college to move into this house. And it was a really bizarre sort of 50 pages that I wrote for this novel. I didn't really know where it would go. And I think there's probably a handwritten copy somewhere in a trunk or in a box on a moleskin notebook somewhere. But it was a really weird book, but set in the South. And I don't know what influences were there, except for maybe Stephen King's, like your basic horror, pop horror things. And at this point in my writing adolescence is what I'll call it, I guess. I was probably 22, 23 at the time. My writing adolescence was more influenced by movies. I thought I would be a movie novelist, someone who wrote like really short, quick, to the quick, bleeding novels, just like these are quick 170-page killer books. But it didn't work out that way. I still tend to be pretty verbose. So like the first novel I wrote, I had read Stephen King's On Writing, and he said, a good book is, 100,000 words, and a really good book is 180,000 words. That's sort of where he comes down on it. But I topped out at like 95,000 with that first book, and ever since then I've written like really kind of big books, like sort of bigger than they should be, but not too big. And the first book was like that, and then this novel that I was going to write about this kid who moved into his parents' house after the dad murdered the mom several years later, it never really came together because the logic of the book made no sense to me. It was kind of a book about small towns, but it never really stuck. That was the first book idea. And the second book idea was, of course, originally Boogie House. And it was way different. Sorry, I'm drinking water. I don't get too parched. But the second book was Boogie House. It was a book about writing, and a book about the South. But the version that I first wrote, I still have a copy of. I still have the original first few chapters of this book, and to read it now is such a weird failure. It's such a weird beginning of a novel that became the thing that eventually got published. And I have a copy I'm going to be reading from a little bit later. I meant to tease that, but I'll probably be reading a little bit of it later, than maybe the first chapter, part of the first chapter. But originally this book was such a weird thing because it started as, first of all, I knew that I wanted to write a book about racism in the South. That's sort of like one of the prevailing themes of Southern literature. It could be considered a cliche, but it just sort of grows down here, and it sort of like hangs from the moss of the trees, and it invades everything that is Southern. So I couldn't help but write about it. And sort of dealing with some of the issues of the South that I had and have growing up and living here for my whole life. So it's kind of a novel about the South told through the eyes of this one character. And I don't know how I came to name the main character Rolson McCain. I have almost no idea where that came from. I just knew that I wanted a different name, and it's just that's not a name I've ever heard of. And I guess maybe James M. Cain probably influenced it, and the word Cain as sort of a biblical character and person, someone who is stained with like the sort of like historical familial stain from generations ago have cursed this person to be who he is, kind of. And I thought that was an interesting way of dealing with who Southern people can be. And I knew that I still knew though that I wanted my character to not be like the sorts of people I was going to be poking fun at. This is not a satire, but I definitely wanted to poke fun at the South a little bit and its own traditions. And but the first draft came about because I thought of the title of the book first, kind of, and I thought of I just one day thought of these words. When I first started writing, I was obsessed with titling things and coming up with. I thought that if I came up with a really good title, then the book would be easy to follow, or the short story. Originally even this could have been a short story. So I came up with the title first, but I didn't title it Boogie House first. I titled it The Body in the Boogie House, and I thought that was kind of neat. And one of my best friends, a college buddy, thought it was kind of a neat title too. A little long. Admittedly, it's kind of Night of the Living Dead, Body in the Boogie House. I just love the bees and just the rounded way that sounded. I like the word boogie, and it's kind of a play on the words like boogeyman. And I thought that there would be. Boogie is to dance, but Boogie is also like a dark figure who, the boogeyman. And this book I thought could be an embodiment of all of that. I thought that it could be kind of a ghost story, kind of like a detective story, kind of a horror novel, and all kind of rolled into one. And that is me in like the most short term is that I am kind of all of those things. As a writer, I am all of those things. And as a person, that's what I like to read. I love reading true crime. I love reading detective novels. I love reading horror. And I love ghost stories. So this is the perfect amalgamation of all of those things. And so I decided to go with that as sort of like the theme and the whole of the plot. But originally, it was much more influenced by Sam Raimi. Because I remember the first chapter of the first version of the book read almost comically. I mean, it was I didn't quite have the subtlety as a writer, and some might argue I still don't. But originally, I had Rolson be much more sort of like put off and afraid, like visually afraid of the sight of a ghost, and like I had the ghost, the original dead character who eventually became Emmett Laveau. Originally, he was much more prone to saying things that seemed to come out of other books or like that were approximations of like really famous lines from horror novels or like the Bible or something. I thought for some reason that would give it some sort of like a literary slant, but the first draft just petered out. I kept writing. In the first draft, Russell McCain wakes up on a park bench somewhere and with two people beside him talking about things they don't think he can understand because they think he's too drunk to get it. So I had him walking around and like walking and it's like perambulating is kind of a part of this novel. Like slow movement is something that I find very interesting and especially found interesting for this book. So it's there from the very first draft. So in the original first draft of the book, or like the broken not draft of Boogie House, he wakes up and walks to his house but cuts through the woods because he's drunk and has to pee and ends up peeing in this old abandoned juke joint and finds a dead body. And that was sort of the first draft. And the discussion, like in the first draft, they have a discussion almost immediately and he runs home and he's like, oh my God, what's going on? I'm crazy. Or am I drunk? And it never really recovered from that because it was just, I knew that I wanted the book to start very quickly. Because I sort of had the feeling that if I was going to hook somebody, it had to be very soon. So I knew that the book had to start and go. And I've always tried to write that way. But this book, I thought, had to start with a dead body. And originally, the book was going to be titled something else, and Body in the Boogie House was going to be part 1. It was going to be a book in 3 parts. Just one big long novel and sort of like It length, but about all of these things and characters and the South. But never that never materialized. The character didn't have the depth early on. I just knew I wanted to write about this kind of guy, and I wanted him to be a drunk. I knew that early on too. I wanted him to be sort of not an unreliable narrator, but just kind of an unreliable person and character for the audience to get behind. I wanted them to have to I wanted him to earn their trust a little bit by being a decent guy eventually, but sort of a shit heel early on. And he definitely, that also, I think, carries through the sort of like childish, selfish egotism that Rolston McCain has. Definitely follows through this final draft of Boogie House. And so that was important. But I gave up on the book early on, but it never quite went away. I mean, I wrote other books, and I think I learned a lot through writing those other books. And maybe this one was just one that, not to sound sort of too gooey about all this, but I think the book sort of needed time to settle in and become something else before I came back to it. Because I wrote other things. I wrote several other novels. Like I wrote some really pulpy books. I wrote a book called One Last Drag that's sticking out in my mind about a guy who comes home and finds a dead guy on his couch. I guess dead guys in houses is my bit. I guess that if I had to pick a theme for what I write about, that seems to be it, is dead people inside houses specifically. But no, I mean, I won't go into the plots of all the books, but I wrote a lot of pulpy fiction. I wrote some horror novels. I wrote a couple like really short novellas, like a book. I wrote a book called Kegger about a guy, kind of like, this was my Michael Myers story. It was about a guy who comes home and his home has become an apartment complex. Like he lived in low rent housing that had been gentrified into an apartment complex, and he decides to just start murdering all of the people at this keg party that's going on, this once a year party. And I thought it was kind of a neat idea. It didn't quite work. I might go back to it. It kind of sounds interesting coming back to like the elevator pitch of it. Halloween at a keg party kind of sounds interesting. So I might come back to that idea. But eventually I came back to the idea of Boogie House. I knew that this is something that my old college buddy Johnny and I talked about a lot, and he wanted to see the story through. And I would just tell him what I thought the story should be eventually. And eventually it became, for me at least, a story about a really broken man sort of finding a way to become human again and like responsible through being pushed into doing it. Not really of his own volition, but someone who sort of like gets pulled into the right circumstances. And I think those kinds of novels can work. I didn't want to make a novel that was just like, here's a detective and he is cool and he solves the crime and gets the girl, which that's not really hard not to write. It's not like, I don't think Boogie House is sort of breaking boundaries, but I think it is sort of a genre mashup. I'll quote a buddy of mine who said that it's kind of Justified meets The Shining, which I hadn't thought of. I was thinking more like James Lee Burke's In the Electric Mist with Confederate Dead meets Flannery O'Connor, but that's also overreaching a little bit. But I mean, when I first started writing a book, I mean, Flannery O'Connor is someone I thought about a lot. I mean, I thought about Good Country People, the story specifically. I think Good Country People is the one where the guy with the fake leg gets his fake leg stolen, right? I can't remember. It's been so long at this point since I've actually read Flannery O'Connor, but Wise Blood played heavy into it. And I was also really into Cormac McCarthy at this point. This was 2007, 2008. So I was really into short, terse, fictional styles, but also the sort of like floral like descriptions that James Lee Burke has, where it's just so like earthy and of the area that I thought, I can do that for the South. And so I just embarked on writing this book. I think it just came to me. And I worked really hard on that first real draft. After it came back to me in 2008 or so, I was working at a copy shop in Athens, Georgia. I was a manager in a copy shop, and I had vast stretches of my day that I didn't have a lot to do, and even if I did, sometimes I kind of uh, like let my responsibilities go because it gave me time to write. Because the boss wasn't really there a lot. He was starting a new operation in another city, and so I had a lot of free time. And the book got written there, and I didn't feel quite so bad about it because at that point I was reading a lot of writing about writing, and Elmore Leonard talked about writing his first few books while he was working as like an ad copywriter, and like he would work on those books during the day when he should have been doing other things. So I didn't feel bad about it, but I worked really hard on it. I was writing like 1,500 words a day at work, but it wasn't just the novel. It was like plotting it out and writing outlines. This is really the only book I've ever totally outlined to any degree. Like I wrote the first draft, but I didn't really like the ending. I'm not going to spoil it because the book's not even out, but I wrote the original ending and was sort of underwhelmed by it because of how it portrays the character of Rolson. Like I didn't really take to that ending very well, so I kind of cut it out. And I was like, I need a different ending. But that was what started this process of being a really long time between finishing and being published. Was that I didn't quite know how to fix the ending. I didn't know how I wanted to make the ending different from what it was. I kind of knew what the ending needed to be, but I didn't know how to get there. And it took a lot of revision to get there. I mean, I wrote 3 full drafts. I wrote 3 complete drafts of it. 3 major revisions at least. Like I didn't sit down and completely rewrite the book, but I heavily edited it. I mean, I would, once the book is out, there's a good chance I will release some of the edited stuff just as something people can peruse if they feel like it for the book, because I cut a lot out of it. And it was hard because I didn't want to cut some of the stuff I cut. A lot of the sort of like local color stuff that I thought was really cool just had to go for the sake of the story. You get self-conscious. The longer you sit with a book, the more self-conscious you become with the text itself. I mean, you start to think that I need to make it shorter. I need to respect people's time. So I think the book originally was like 110,000 words. It was huge. And somehow I managed to get it down to 94,000 words at some point. But now I think the book is like 112,000. Like it's still a huge book, even with my editing. I still cut tens of thousands of words out, and then ended up adding tens of thousands of words back in. So it's still a long book, and it went through several revisions. I mean, there are parts of it that I added after I decided to make it a 4-part series, and that was. There will be a finite number of Rolson McCain books. I have them mapped out in my head, just not completely outlined, but there is a finite number of them because I think that the character of Rolson McCain is not someone who could endure the sorts of things that happened to him in this first book for an entire series. Nor do I want to subject him to that. Like I couldn't see myself annualizing this for the sake of anything. So I think it'll be easy for me to write these 4 books, but then be done, like completely done with this character, because that's kind of the arc, and that's influenced a little bit by the Hank Thompson trilogy by Charlie Houston, because that arc of books tells the story of a really messed up character who has a definite arc, and I wanted something similar to that. Charlie Houston's also a pretty big influence on me, at least the Hank Thompson stuff. I like the Joe Pitt books, vampire detective stuff and all, but it's not quite what I want to go for in my own writing. So it didn't quite influence me as much as it was just kick-ass to read. So that's sort of what I strive for. I wish I could be as sort of terse and brief as he is as a writer, but I'm totally not. I'm not that writer. Like as we speak now, I'm 25 minutes into the podcast, and I feel like I'm halfway done with the story that I want to tell about this book. I mean, I guess the outset of it isn't is really most of the story anyway. I mean, revision is revision, but the basic plot elements are, I guess, the things that I can go to. There will be minor spoilers here, or minor slash major spoilers. So if you haven't finished the book, maybe go read it and come back to this. I'm going to be doing a reading of the first chapter at the end of this, but for now, the actual parts of the book are things I'm going to talk about because I'm interested in sort of digging up where I came from. Some of the stuff from. Came up with some of the stuff. I'm sorry. Originally, the book takes place in the same town as another book that I wrote called The Intersection, and I guess Lumber Junction is in both of them, kind of, but one is sort of, I called it, I can't remember, but Lumber Junction is the name of the town, and it's very similar to the town I grew up in. And it's modeled on the town I grew up in, but kind of only in geography only. The people in it are not. I did not pull it from local politicians or anything like that. There was no sort of hate crimes that happened that I can remember that would have inspired the book. I was inspired by past famous hate crimes and that sort of thing, but nothing that was very specific. I mean, the town itself is based on my hometown of Soperton, Georgia, which is a tiny, tiny town. It is probably most famous for two things. One being the annual Arts and Crafts Festival. It's called the Million Pine City, which is one of the reasons that the town's called Lumber Junction is because of the pine trees. And the second thing that Soperton, Georgia is famous for is that Ben Affleck got a speeding ticket for going 116 miles an hour there. So those are the two things that make Soperton famous. And so I based the town on my hometown. I sort of like spruced it up a little bit, but I gave it sort of a decrepit, dying vibe. Like the town itself is on its deathbed, as a lot of small towns are these days. This was at the height of the fear of Walmart taking over the world, which has kind of gone away. Now it's just Amazon taking everything over, but Amazon has sort of displaced Walmart as like the big fear, like the retail fear. Because I grew up in a town where there were a lot of like retail shops that have now closed due to convenience and cheapness. And like I thought that my book would be a commentary on that, but now it's sort of, that idea has aged a little bit, and people seem less like furious about the idea of Walmart and the sort of like Walmartification, I don't know, that sort of idea about society, and so the murder itself is taken from, originally Emmett Laveau was named Emmett Till, Teal, Teel, but just sort of a really stupid play on Emmett Till, Till, the famous murder that helped to kind of spark the civil rights movement. I knew it was a bad idea. It was sort of this is going to sound really insensitive, but it was kind of a placeholder name for a long time. I knew that I wanted, I knew I wanted a book that was about race, but I thought that was entirely too on the nose. But the name Emmett definitely comes from that. But I eventually changed it to a sort of French Cajun name, Laveau, which is a very popular Louisiana name and a really sort of beautiful name. Emmett Laveau is kind of a beautiful, beautiful name. And everything sort of rises out of that character. That Emmett Laveau is sort of the unspoken hero of the book, and he has a lot to do with what makes the book interesting to me and why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to get some backstory in there, and I wanted the murder to be significant in and of itself. So I'm going to try not to spoil anything, but just that character I thought was really important. Some of the other characters, like Ronald Bullen, was originally named Ronald and H.W. Bullen, were originally named Bane, and that too was kind of a placeholder. I thought it was very obvious and on the nose, kind of name for two characters, Bane. It just way obvious. I mean, the symbolism sometimes can be tricky to pull off, and so I think that I'm glad I changed the names to Ronald and H.W. Bullen, because otherwise I don't think it would have worked. But those characters are based, I don't know, like loosely on a lot of really stereotypical people of the South, and not to say stereotypes from the South, but like a stereotypical type of cop character that I wanted to give sort of some like lived in nature to. Like these are well worn people. I thought, and I tried to imbue them with life. I tried to take some sort of caricatures and some sort of stereotypes and give them like a real feel, like these people could actually exist. And I think I accomplished that with Ronald Bullen. I tried to give each person some depth so that it wasn't just like, oh, here is this bad guy. And he's definitely a bad guy. As you see from like the first scene that he deals with Roland. The first scene he deals with Rolson, like he's not a good dude. He's crabby and bad. And he's a cop, but there's also these other layers to him. So I think that's important as far as like writing characters goes, and that's something that I've learned over writing several novels. Is this important to make sure that like whoever you include in a book should have some amount of depth. Like try to make even small characters as round as possible and not static. If you can, like give them a scene, give them a good note at some point so you can root for them. It can come later, but I think that needs to happen. Now, the idea of the Boogie House, of a place where people would go, old juke joints. I mean, if you've ever been to the South, the part of the South I'm from, the roads and highways are lined with dilapidated buildings. And I think that the image of a sort of like clapboard tin roof building falling over has always been in my subconscious and has always kind of existed in my mind. I grew up in a place where that sort of thing happened. Like my mom talked about going to her grandfather's house, and she took me to visit it, or the remains of it, several times, and she reminded me of sleeping in a bedroom where there were holes in the floor, and there was a part underneath the house where the chickens would run. She could see chickens at night, like through the holes in the floor. And that was such an indelible image. That's something I will take with me forever. So I thought that was kind of an inspiration for the book, along with all of the houses that I've seen over the years, driving to and from Athens, Georgia, to my hometown, to doing the hiking that I do, seeing the houses that like inspire. They sort of inspired the feel of the Boogie House. As far as the idea of an abandoned juke joint, I don't think there's one in my hometown. Not that I know of, but I made that up from whole cloth. But I thought the idea of like a place in the woods where people went to get away from the hatred around them was kind of an interesting idea. And that's sort of the outset of the Boogie House, is that it was constructed as a way of people getting away from the mainstream hatred. And it just seemed like a cool idea, playing music in the woods. Like, kind of amazing idea. And so that's also another, like, for me, the Boogie House is a character in the book as well. And I tried to add as much like mythology to it as possible, because I think that kind of thing is super neat. I mean, places take on these sort of mythological dimensions, especially in the South, where places become people almost. I mean, if you read Stephen King's story, It Grows on You, then you get that sense of place. And if this book is sort of like Justified meets The Shining, then the Boogie House is my Overlook Hotel. And it kind of has like that effect on the characters. I don't want to go any more into it than that, but I think that's really important. I don't have much else to say as far as like publication goes. I guess next week I can talk about the business of how I created the book. A lot of people might benefit from hearing how I made the book and how I put stuff together and how like the sort of pratfalls I had while editing and creating the actual text and releasing it. Accidentally releasing the paperback book before the Kindle version was an oopsie moment that I will definitely learn from that next time. But I'm going to do a brief reading. I talked for far longer than I thought I would, so I'm going to do a brief reading from chapter 1 of my novel Boogie House. So if you're watching live, you're going to get to watch somebody read, but if you're listening, then you might enjoy the first chapter of the book. So I'm gonna do a reading of that and hopefully not screw it up. And I don't do voices. I don't think that's a strong suit of mine. Anyone who's ever heard me do accents know that I just can't do them. So I will do my best. And so hope you enjoy the first chapter of Boogie House. Thanks. Here we go. First chapter. And you're going to hear some rustling. I'm going to try to minimize that. But first chapter. I woke a little after midnight, gulped directly from the kitchen faucet, and tried to go back to sleep. Everything smelled like whiskey, and the gentle, watery tilt of the room kept me up. So I flipped to a channel I didn't want to watch and muted the volume. I thought about putting on music, but slide guitar was as appealing to me as fork tines on a dry dinner plate. I tried desperately to become unconscious. I curled up on my stomach, pressed my face to the cool side of the pillow, stared at a show about dead celebrities. The screen's glow aggravated my looming hangover, so I killed the TV and padded through the house, looking for anything to distract me from how bad my head hurt. I tripped over a bag of clothes someone who used to live here left behind. The shirts and jeans still smelled like her. I noticed a sliver of light peeking between the front door and the jamb. I'd left it unlocked again. No real surprise. The bad dreams had started up again ever since the accident, and they put me in a bad headspace even when I was awake. Going to adjust. Here we go, and continue. I sat on the porch in my boxers and smoked the last 2 cigarettes in my pack, watching the fireflies jitter and dance among the deflated azaleas. Every so often, the sky lit up and somewhere miles off a troubling crash split the darkness. The air smelled like coming rain, brought on by clouds black as spilled ink. Sorry, I'm turning it up. I stubbed the cigarette on the steps and flicked the butt into the azaleas, which was probably not helping them. I stood up, ready to go back inside, when an indistinct echo came out of the woods across the road. I strained my ears toward the sound, which could have been a voice calling for help. Could have been a whole lot of things. Out in the country, sounds mutate and become something otherworldly. Or it could have been my imagination. The county where I live isn't big, and yet dirt roads cut through thousands of tree-lined acres, acting as cover for people who take driving sober as mere suggestion. Drunks occasionally flip their pickups, winding a sharp curve, and crush something vital. Usually they'll phone a buddy, though not always. I had sometimes spied grown men ambling like zombies down the road in search of sympathetic strangers, hoping aloud they weren't bleeding to death. Such is the way of life in a small town. There was desperation in the voice I heard, or thought I heard. Reality had been inconsistent for me of late. Too much drinking, too many bad dreams. And there was also the thunder which cut right through the silence, so I couldn't get a handle on what it was exactly. I grabbed my .45 from the house, put on some dusty running shoes and jeans, and headed in that direction. I couldn't sleep anyway. Across the road, I entered a dark copse of pine. Even under a full moon, the limbs, like old gnarled fingers, obscured any trace of light, like walking into a windowless room at midnight. Occasionally, I stopped and listened, hearing nothing, smelling sap and tree rot in the air. I went about my business cautiously since I was trespassing on Leland Brickmeyer's property. This broken, forgotten patch of land wasn't even the beginning of their total holdings, but their laces were tied a little too straight for them to abide me traipsing around like this after midnight. The Brickmeyers had built their wealth on the backs of free labor during Reconstruction. Lumber Junction didn't really even become a place until the railroads were completed, but there had always been white people gracious enough to work poor and displaced minorities to death when it suited their interests. Leland's father had bestowed upon him a small fortune and a thriving timber business, but that last name was the old man's most important gift. Every town has a family like them. Local royalty, like the Kennedys, with a country drawl. Most people who despised them just wanted a backstage pass. Leland had used his last name to great effect, landing opportunities that would have otherwise eluded him. But reality is often harsher than perception. The mismanagement of this tract of land was just the tip of an ever-growing iceberg. He was not his daddy, and the stress fractures in the foundations were beginning to show. He had a bit of a political muscle he wanted to flex, and I'm sure he hoped it was more toned than his entrepreneurial one. Brickmeyer and I had only spoken a few times, and only in an official capacity. Otherwise, I don't know that I could have stomached his glad-handing, empty charisma. He was transparent as a haint on All Hallows' Eve, but nobody seemed to care so long as there was money involved. A clap of thunder snapped me out of my thoughts. I descended a small hill and came to a man-made clearing. I stopped in what used to be a gravel parking lot and watched in a sickened awe. The remnants of a smallish shack leaned to one side in the distance. What had once been a black-owned juke called the Boogie House was now just a rotten shell of a building. And though the doors had officially been closed for decades, tonight the Boogie House lived again. And I'll be damned if it weren't alive. The sound of piano and guitar swelled through the door, and silhouettes of women in knee-length dresses cut through the bright, even light within. I might have even smelled whiskey in the air if I weren't still fairly plastered. A young woman stopped in the doorway, her lithe figure blocking the dance floor. She was light-skinned, beautiful. She bounced to the music, smoking a long, thin cigarette, a frizzy bob undulating atop her head. Her neck was wet with sweat, her red flower-print dress whipping in a non-existent breeze. She turned and looked in my direction, but did not seem to see me. I saw her, but only for a moment. She was blinking in and out, alight with a dimming bulb. A bad fuse box wasn't to blame. These were the spirits of the Boogie House. I had heard dark stories about this place, but had thought it to be mostly old gossip gone wild. The ghosts of decades past lingered there for a while, mixing together in a seductive dance. Dancing to music that wasn't really there. Showing out for me, I suppose. I was sweating despite the breeze, charged with a peculiar energy. I approached the building, sneaking through the woods as if trailing spooked deer, hoping for something, but the whole scene flickered and died. There was a kind of beautiful flash, making blank silhouettes out of the patrons, and then the world went dark. Once again, the shack was old and decrepit and condemnable. Just what it had been long as I had been alive. I stalked unevenly through the dark and pressed myself against the front of the Boogie House. Standing outside the entrance with a trembling finger on the trigger, I waited for my courage to catch up. The air smelled electric and burnt, like ozone but more raw. My nostrils ached from the burning. I felt no immediate danger, but something jerked my instincts taut, and the dull throb of a hangover sharpened my senses. With the moon blocked off by clouds, the Boogie House itself sank into blackness. It was like staring into mud. I turned in the doorway, pointing my weapon at nothing in particular. The voice itself had disappeared, leaving only the illusion of its existence in my head. "Hello," I said, a half-question. "My name is Officer Rolson McCain, Lumber Junction PD. Come on out now, here?" It was a mostly untrue statement, but gave me comfort anyway. I received only silence in return. The air and everything in it was still and silent. Another step forward yielded a patch of soggy wood. I tested my footing and placed some weight on it. I must have been worried too much about myself because I got caught unawares by what happened next. A human shape emerged from the far corner of the boogie house where the wall-length bar would have been. He fired before I could respond. The explosion of sound set off a series of reactions in me. I raised my weapon and dropped to one knee simultaneously, intending on returning fire. That was until the boards holding me buckled, sending me off balance and knee-deep into the ground below. "Stop right there!" I yelled, raising the weapon and struggling mightily to retain balance. But it was too late. The figure kicked out an old window and jumped through it, disappearing into the night in a single, graceless leap. It was in that moment I saw his size. Beast could have been a pro ball player, maybe a wrestler or MMA fighter of some kind. I pulled myself from the hole and backed out of that place. My heart kicked into a higher gear. Blood hummed in my ears. Chasing drunks down Highway 221 and kicking in the doors at suspected meth labs was as exciting as small-town cop life usually got. I hoofed drunkenly through the rows and rows of pines, organized eerily like crosses in a long-forgotten graveyard. Ahead of me, footsteps sliding on loose straw drew me forward. I couldn't very well stop now. Fundamental fear and anger made my feet pump harder than I thought I could. The hulk of a man slammed into a low-hanging branch, sending pine needles everywhere. He cursed, and I ducked just before he opened fire again. His accent was thick, country, but it wasn't a voice I readily identified, and the gun bursts erased my memory. The flashes from the muzzle gave me a brief view of his face, but the darkness obscured all but the most fleeting glances. "Damn it," I said, firing 2 rounds at where he had been. I was sure I hadn't hit him, but I also didn't wait around to find out. Taillights appeared out of nowhere, followed in quick succession by a slamming door and gurgling engine. White lights indicated the transmission slipping over reverse into drive, and then the engine roared, propelling the truck through the pines toward an undisclosed exit. I fired 2 more rounds, hoping to hit something vital. I had to settle for watching the vehicle make its getaway. That wasn't a drunk looking for a lift at all, I said to the emptiness. I returned home, constantly glancing about me and rubbing my arms. I had tied my shirt to a tree so I could find the spot in the morning. The front door was open when I got back. The dreams that had dominated my psyche populated my imagination with all sorts of monsters. I went inside and put my face in every corner of the house before my heart began to slow down. After I was sure I was alone, I sat on the couch in the dark. I used my ancient flip phone like a stress ball, flicking it open and shutting it repeatedly, compulsively. I couldn't force myself to call the station. The chief had made it clear my relationship with the force was to be of a "don't call us, we'll call you" sort of situation. Tonight was making it not easier for me. Since I had trespassed without probable cause and had only jumping hands as proof I'd been shot at, I decided to keep it to myself, for now. Sleep was slow in coming and my dreams unsettled me. Some I remembered in the morning, and a few revolved around my mother, standing in the kitchen amidst steamy dishes, her face smiling down at me through a haze of 3 decades. Mostly, though, I dreamed of the Boogie house. One in particular, which dealt with the guy who owned the land across the way, sent me reaching for my .45, squinting into the doorway of my bedroom. I ended up pointing it at nothing but a vague apparition spilling out of my head. Though I didn't have an indication that Leland Brickmeyer had anything to do with me getting shot at, I awoke in the dark with his face hovering above me, and I very nearly fired my pistol at it. Sort of flubbed the last line there, and a few in the middle, so if you're listening, I apologize for those. Maybe edit them out, but thanks for enduring and listening to the first chapter of my book, Boogie House. I'm super excited and stoked about this. And I really hope that you go out and pick it up. It's available on Amazon. It's in the Kindle store, so go to Amazon, just search for Boogie House. It is now above, it's the top entry for Boogie House, above Canned Heat's Boogie House tapes, which I'm particularly proud of. So please go check it out and read it, buy it, pre-order it. It's also available in paperback. So check it out. Follow the podcast. PrincipledU at gmail.com is the email, at PU Podcast on Twitter. Otherwise, find me at tblakebraddy.com. There's plenty of stuff there, other short stories. If you listen to this and like my voice, then I've read some of my own short stories there too. So there's plenty of content for you to dig through. So you can follow me on Twitter at Blake Braddy, BlakeBraddy. So I don't have a music cue to go out to. I just left this cold. So thanks for listening, and see you next week on the Principled Uncertainty Podcast. Bye now.